Hello everyone, I'm Shima and I'm really happy to see you on my channel. In this lesson, I'll show you how to paint a portrait in watercolor using a classic layered technique. After I've sketched my portrait, the first thing I start with is the filling and the base, the lightest tone and color of what will be showing through. It's going to be even darker later on, but to avoid having to glaze the lightest areas too much, I go ahead and make the base right away. It's not always necessary, but in this case it was easier for me. I made a uniform base all over the portrait at once. You can see that I'm adding shades right away. For example, I filled in the hair and added some blue right away. In the shadows, I'm also adding some more terracotta shades in some places, and in others I'm adding cool tones right away. With the first layers, I also sketch out where my shadows will be and highlight some facial features. So you could see that right after this first filling, I also sketched out the eyebrows, the nose line, and the eyelid fold. I don't outline the boundary with the hair in a dark color right away, because where the hair growth starts, there will always be a soft transition to the skin. So, considering that, it's a bit more reddish, so I softened it right away. If you happen to darken something too much, always keep some toilet paper, paper napkins, or a cloth in your hand. You can dab it, or you can dry the brush and use it to pick up anything that has dripped where it shouldn't. So I immediately show where everything will be, so my drawing doesn't get lost under the glazes and stays intact. So that I can also see right away where my shadows are on the portrait, where the colors are, where the facial features are, regarding the variety of colors in these fills and bases.
Hey friends, if you like my videos and want to see more of them, give me a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new videos. Don't forget about the bell, and of course leave your comments down below this video.
I often say in my videos that I work from dark to light, but watercolor artists get confused. If no one ever asks questions in a drawing, then it's those who have trained in watercolor who seem to have a question about terminology here. When I say that I work from dark, you've all seen that I first created a base, of course, underneath everything. Why? Because the eyes are no longer on white paper. We remember that there was a warm base, plus I'm also glazing them periodically now. I work from dark, meaning I immediately fill in the dark areas. So I have dark hair, and I filled it in with dark right away. Where I have shadows, I also marked from the first layers, well, not from the very first, but from the second layer, where the dark areas on the face will be. Then there's the outfit of this girl, this scarf, this shawl. But gradually I make all of it darker, darker, darker. That is, I immediately outline all these dark moments, but at the same time I make them very pale. And with each subsequent layer, the main principle of working is layered. And the point of it is that we don't risk making a mistake, because when we draw a portrait with a pencil, it seems similar. But when we add tone, just like in drawing and in painting, regardless of the technique, our work changes depending on whether it's just outlined or if it already has the right tones with light, shadow, and so on. Something dark has become dark, because dark spots look much smaller than light spots. If we don't add shadows from the first layer, we can't objectively see what the proportions will be at the end of our work. And you might end up with a surprise if you work from those very bases and only then reveal the shadows. The surprise could be that the person just doesn't look like the reference and has completely different facial proportions. So I usually add dark spots right away, but these dark spots are pale. So they aren't dark on their own in the work. But I add where I have shadows, and I divide it into areas of light, areas of shadow, and areas of local dark and local light spots. I hope that's clear. If not, definitely write in the comments. There's a technique where we work from local spots, so we make a completely uniform base, focusing on tone and color of the light. I'm not a fan of this method for several reasons. Because first of all, the color of the light and the shadows are different. These are different colors, and I insist on that, because they can be completely different, and then we won't be able to layer the shadow color on the already applied light color, and we'll end up with a muddy or mismatched color. If you paint it right away separately, filling in the light, and as you can see, my face is warmer, my neck is cooler, and it goes into shadow, a kind of purple, because there will be reflections from the blue-purple fabric of our clothing. So here I immediately added that shade from the first fills. because otherwise there will be a conflict and you'll end up with an ugly brown shadow. So personally, I like to add shades right away. But that's another question. Do we really need to add so many shades at once, like you see now? No, that's not necessary at all. As you paint a lot and for a long time, especially from life, first of all, you'll learn how different paints layer on top of each other. You'll already have some specific experience and it will be on a subconscious level. Secondly, you can make it simpler. So, if there aren't any really different bright shades or bright reflections, you can almost paint it muddy. Well, with local spots that are almost muddy. But in this case, in the subsequent layers, you'll be able to add shades, reflections, and so on. Personally, I like to do all of this right away because there's a certain thrill in the painterly aspect of the work that we can see from the very first layers. From the very first layers, I can see where I have different temperatures and shades of colors. I'm also adding these little shades. Sometimes I add them more brightly on purpose as a base again under the top layers. So the shade I applied underneath will shine through the top layer. There's also a charm and pleasure in that. I created this work for a portrait course in watercolor for my online school. If you're interested in exploring this topic in more detail, seeing how I paint it without speeding up, and of course, a much longer course with detailed discussions of each moment. Well, in this video, I've also put together a time-lapse of this assignment for you, and I hope to provide you with some useful information. Maybe you disagree with something, or perhaps you've learned from other teachers. Most likely, if you're watching this video, you've seen more than one video on the topic of watercolor portraits, and curious about how they taught it there, what the differences are. Opinions often differ on whether we start with a light wash or go from dark and so on. In the meantime, as I continue with my portrait, with each subsequent layer, I add shades, halftones, and shadows, increasing the contrast of the work. So what is contrast? It's when we have a difference between light and shadow, light and dark. Including in the shades, the contrast increases as well. So in some places the cool tones come out more, and in others the warm tones come out more. On the hair, I'm using pure ultramarine. I'm using ultramarine for the last layers. I mix a little where it's more red. I also use scarlet. With different purples, I already had the bases at the bottom, so I can highlight this shine on the hair more brightly. What brushes to use for watercolor? So, for different effects, we can use different brushes, but the most practical brushes are thick, round brushes with a sharp tip. In that case, if you have just one such brush, you could paint the entire portrait with just that one brush. The biggest one for the first washes of large areas is a round brush with a sharp tip. Then the medium brush, and the thinnest one is for eyelashes, fine hairs, and delicate lines. These brushes are more than enough to paint just about anything. If you want some striking strokes, you can also use a flatter brush to fill in beautifully, so those can be additional brushes. Why not use them? If you have a sharp tip on a round brush, you can do both washes and details with just that one brush, thanks to its fine tip. Speaking of the bristles of brushes for watercolor painting, these can be natural bristles like squirrel or Kolinsky. It can also be synthetic. Synthetic brushes have already been made really well. They hold water beautifully. They have different softness and different levels of water retention. There are already synthetic brushes that can even be softer than squirrel hair. Therefore, here too, someone has their own preferences, or rather convictions about not torturing animals. Minimizing damage to nature, they can already confidently buy brushes that are made of synthetic bristles. You can also paint with regular synthetic brushes. Just get a bigger one so it holds more water. When it comes to detailing, I prefer to use synthetic brushes for those last little details. And I do the detailing with synthetic brushes in my oil works and in any technique I work with. When it comes to strokes, I generally like to work with the technique of hatching. In the study drawing, I often have students hatch something because it teaches them to see the overall volumes. But in watercolor too, I make movements that are very similar to strokes. If you rewind and watch this work again, you'll see it clearly. Even the big washes, I apply them in lines. And then I make these little strokes smaller, so the brush works like a pencil. Sometimes I get messages saying, "What's going on? After the third layer, the paper will be ruined." No, the paper doesn't care. If you're working correctly and not damaging it, you can apply 30 or even 40 layers and nothing will happen. Another misconception is that watercolor won't be lively or won't breathe if you use a lot of layers. It doesn't depend on the number of layers at all. If you apply the paint too thickly, then it can happen with just one layer, where the paint will lay down like paste, like gouache, and the paper won't show through. The main rule of watercolor painting is that the paper should shine through even in the darkest areas. Here in my work there are dark areas, almost black, but the paper still gives that illumination, that glow. As soon as you have a solid layer, that spot immediately stands out. It looks dirty and separate from the whole piece. So, in watercolor, it's really important to keep all these colors. Well, of course, I don't work with white paint because in classical technique, you don't use white. There's no need for that. I don't judge those who do it. So, it's all about getting used to it and understanding why. But I can always see what white paint is in the work. What I would recommend if, for example, you've muddied your eyes and didn't keep the highlights from the first layers. You can just take tempera and use it to create those highlights and glaze over them to give them some shade. Or you can mix tempera right in with the watercolor. But under no circumstances should you use the white paint that comes in watercolor sets. Using white paint in watercolor always looks really bad in the work. It creates muddy colors, and that transparency, the beauty of watercolor colors, their purity, gets clouded over, resulting in very unattractive shades. So if you want to cut corners or make your life easier, instead of painting the highlights right away, you can do them later with white paint. Again, I don't do that, but if you want to, go ahead and paint them. Use white paint, but make sure it's tempera and give it some kind of tint, because even highlights aren't purely white. They have some shade to them. Just a reminder, at the beginning of my work, I had a warm-toned base, and the highlights still turned out bright at the end. Once you have a grasp of the basics, you can freely experiment with the materials and come up with your own ideas, mixing techniques and all. I just try to minimize any complicated situations for you while working and make your life as easy as possible. I hope you found my tips interesting and, most importantly, useful. Write below what topic of the video you would like to discuss in the next ones. And if you're interested in exploring the topic of watercolor portraits more deeply, welcome to my online school.